Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Trouble Begins at 5:30 from the Mark Twain House Museum. As always, I'm Jody DeBrine. I'm the Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House. I want to welcome you all to tonight's fabulous lecture. Before we get going, I have a couple administrative things that most of you are familiar with by now, but nonetheless have to say. First, as many of you guys have found, there is a chat box along the side of the screen there. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves during the program, ask questions and things like that. But if you have a question for Dwayne for at the end of his program during the Q&A section, there's an Ask a Question feature down at the bottom of your screen. And you can put your questions in there, and that's where I'll select from for the Q&A at the end. Right next to that Ask a Question feature, there is a green kind of box that says, your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum. Please donate here. We try to keep these events free and open to the public and all of that, but every dollar helps us, whether it's $1, $5, $10, $100. Every part of it goes to supporting the Mark Twain House and keeping our doors open and all of that. So I'd also like to thank our sponsors for the Trouble Begins series. The Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York, make this program possible. And so thank you to them. And last but not least, I want to welcome our guest tonight, Dwayne Yutzi. He's a Georgetown University graduate, a writer, academic, and editor. He has done most of his research, or maybe not most, but a lot of research in developing his master's thesis on Mark Twain's complex religious views. So we'll hear a little bit about that tonight. And so without further ado, welcome, Dwayne, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jody. I appreciate this opportunity. And I also wanted to thank everybody who's tuning in from what looks like a wide range of locations. So I'm really happy to see that. And before we get started tonight, I wanted to just offer a couple of caveats. One, where I'm located here in Maryland, we currently are undergoing the movement of Hurricane Ida coming up the East Coast. And so we've got some storms coming through. And just within the past half hour, we had a couple of tornado warnings. So I think we're out of the danger range right now. But obviously, if I'm suddenly called away for unexpected circumstances, I will hopefully be able to do this again at another time. But let's all hope and click our heels 3 times and wish real hard that that won't happen. And then the other one I wanted to offer, the other caveat was that although we now currently live in the Zoom age, I still prefer the old-fashioned way of being in a real room with real people. So bear with me if I'm a little clunky making a presentation in this type of format. And as if I might be a little clunky maneuvering around this virtual room we're in. So this is going to be the first test here to see if I can bring up my slide presentation. And I think we're going to be fine. And there we go. So I've been researching Twain and religion as an independent scholar for over 2 decades, but I have yet to make a pilgrimage to the Mark Twain House and Museum, unfortunately. Although it would have been nice to give this presentation on Joseph Twichell and Huck Finn there live, it's still truly an honor, and I'm very, very thankful for this opportunity to offer it through this virtual connection to the sacred place that Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, called home for so long. And he did consider this house sacred, although he traveled extensively for much of his life. The home Twain built in Hartford with his beloved Livy and their 3 daughters was the living center, the heart and soul of his existence. Even when he moved away in grief after the tragic loss of his daughter, Susie, Twain would write from London to the Reverend Joseph Twichell, his neighbor, pastor, and dear friend in Hartford. To us, our house was not an unsentient matter. It had a heart and a soul and eyes to see us with, and approvals and solicitudes and deep sympathies. It was of us, and we were in its confidence and lived in its grace and in the peace of its benediction. We never came home from an absence that its face did not lighten up and speak out its eloquent welcome, and we could not enter it unmoved. It's not surprising that the grieving Twain would share this moving tribute to his house and to his home with Joe Twichell. As anyone here who has read Steve Courtney's excellent biography of Twichell knows, the devout Christian minister and the irreverent humorist had been fast friends since meeting in 1868, when Twain jokingly referred to Twitchell's prosperous house of worship, the Asylum Hill Congregational Church, as the Church of the Holy Speculators. Their friendship would span the next 4 decades, ending only with Twain's death in 1910. They made something of an odd couple, to be sure, yet despite Twitchell's unabashed devotion to Christianity and Twain's apparent religious skepticism, which, in my opinion, has been greatly exaggerated, each profoundly influenced the other, particularly in literary matters. As Twain told a Boston reporter in 1874, Twichell sometimes gained ideas from Twain that he embodied in his sermons, while Twain got information from his pastor that he worked up into comical and humorous stories. A friend and classmate of Twitchell's from Yale also observed in his memoirs that Dr. Twichell often furnished in the rough the jewels which afterwards in Mark Twain's workshop became perfect gems. For example, during one of their long walks to Talcott Mountain, Twichell encouraged Twain to write Life on the Mississippi. He also played a role in Twain's development of The Prince and the Pauper. Twain even wrote a rather lewd story, 1601, for Twichell that the minister found hilarious. As Twain would put it, Twichell came within an ace of killing himself with laughter. For between you and me, Twain said, the thing was dreadfully funny. However, although Twichell was rather tolerant and open-minded, probably due in some part to having served as a battlefield chaplain during the Civil War, the one thing that the minister really didn't have much patience with or could countenance was blasphemy. This trait might appear to be at odds with my contention that Twichell had a theologically positive influence on Mark Twain's classic, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Not only does this book, in parts, mock the Bible and Christianity, at its pivotal climax, the skeptical young narrator even defiantly chooses hell over doing what he believes to be God's will. Huckleberry Finn has always been steeped in controversy, of course. Today, it's among the top banned books in American school libraries, mostly because of its volatile issue of race. Despite its popularity when it first published in 1884, Huckleberry Finn provoked controversy when the Concord Public Library banned it from its shelves, deeming it trash of the veriest sort. They condemned it for its absolutely immoral tone, couched in the language of a rough, ignorant dialect. Twain, of course, delighted in that controversy because it ended up selling more books for him. In terms of blasphemy, however, at least one scholar posited a century later, back in the 1980s, that Twain's most famous work ultimately reveals his rejection of the divinity of Jesus Christ. If this is true, which is debatable, could someone as devout as Joe Twichell positively influence such an allegedly immoral and heretical story? Spoiler alert, the short answer, in my opinion, is yes. For the longer answer, I will need to draw from sermons Twichell preached in 1876 as Mark Twain was beginning to formulate his story. In my opinion, these sermons had a greater thematic influence on the book than is generally realized. Now, to understand how, we'll first need to understand the religious ethos of the mid-1870s and where I see Twichell and Twain on the spectrum of religious liberalism at this time. Then I will discuss two eulogy sermons that Twichell preached in honor of his mentor, the controversial Hartford divine Horace Bushnell, and ultimately how I see these sermons shaping Twain's depiction of prayer in Huckleberry Finn and doing it in such a way that I contend saved Huckleberry Finn from hell. So to begin with, what do I mean by religious liberalism? Essentially, I'm referring to a form of theology emerging after the Enlightenment, at which time religion became more subject to rigorous critical scrutiny. And although some of the early liberal theologians, mainly in Germany, concluded Christianity was largely a myth, with some even convinced that Jesus never existed, many liberal American clergy hoped to maintain Christianity's vitality among the upheaval of the scientific and industrial revolutions. And devout religious liberals of varying theological stripes hoped to develop a modern way, a middle way, between the atheistic rationalism of the French Revolution and the old superstitions and orthodox doctrines of traditional faith, striving instead to liberate religion from thraldom to irrational and merely traditional authority. Now, in the mid-1870s, when Twain began to write Huckleberry Finn, it was known as having a spirit of intellectual adventurism in theology. And this encompassed everyone from devout Christian liberals like Horace Bushnell on one end of the era's progressive spectrum, to Unitarians in the middle, many of whom began as liberal Christians, but were increasingly leaning away from their roots, to those on the radical end of the spectrum, where Emerson and others were moving beyond traditional Christianity. Now, in the book that I'm writing, I'm hoping to show that despite Mark Twain's ever-shifting place on this spectrum, a religious liberal sensibility followed him throughout his life, his entire life. Early in his career, Twain observed that a religion that comes of thought and study and deliberate conviction sticks best, capturing that feel of the theological liberals that I was talking about being more scrutinizing in your approach to faith, while toward the end of his life, as he dismissed unexamined orthodox opinions in religion and politics as not worth a brass farthing. Now, growing up in Hannibal, where his ambition to be a preacher of the gospel was second only to being a riverboat pilot, Twain was influenced early on by Calvinism, but as he got older, I place him closer to the liberal Christian end of the spectrum of religious liberalism. Although there were significant heterodox influences from his father's freethinking, his uncle's universalism, Thomas Paine's deism, as well as Freemasonry. Twain joined the St. Louis Lodge before the Civil War broke out. Now, while living on the Western frontier during the conflict, Twain befriended several nationally prominent progressive Christian ministers there. In the late 1860s, while courting Olivia Langdon in Elmira, who was herself from a devout liberal Christian family there, Twain shifted back to the end of the spectrum where they were, where he also became friends with two liberal-minded Christian ministers who were proteges of Horace Bushnell. One of them was Thomas Beecher, the Langdon's minister in Elmira, and Joe Twichell in Hartford. Now, by the time Twain began to write Huckleberry Finn in 1876, I still see him somewhere around the liberal Christian end of the spectrum. But at this time, and based on my research, he seems to be growing more restless and shifting a little bit more and more toward the radical end. And eventually that's where I see him going toward for the rest of his life. But not at this time. I still see him sort of identifying with Joe Twichell's kind of Christianity. And to help illustrate where Twain and Joe Twichell were theologically at this time, we can go back to Hartford shortly after Christmas in 1875, when Twain introduced Twichell to another friend of his in the clergy, a man by the name of Moncure Conway. Now, although Conway is mainly known in Twain's studies as Twain's literary representative in England, he also happens to be one of the era's leading intellectuals, widely known for his theological and political radicalism. In fact, one historian goes so far as to call Conway the most thoroughgoing white male radical produced by the antebellum South. He's such an intriguing figure that an entire lecture could be dedicated to him, but for our purposes tonight, I'll be brief to give you a little summary of who he was. Moncure Conway was from an aristocratic, slave-owning family in Virginia, but he went on to become an outspoken egalitarian and abolitionist in the years leading up to the Civil War. During this time, he left the South to attend Harvard Divinity School, where he was a protege of Emerson's, whom Conway fondly referred to as his spiritual father. During the 1850s and 60s, abolitionism became an all-consuming passion for him. As the minister of First Unitarian Church in D.C., Conway's anti-slavery advocacy was so strident that the church's gentile congregation ended up dismissing him from the pulpit. Shortly after the Civil War began, Conway personally asked President Lincoln to make abolishing slavery the conflict's ultimate goal. He believed so strongly in emancipation that he even helped 31 of his father's slaves escape to Ohio. And by the time Twain met him in England, 1872, Conway was a well-known lecturer and author living as an expatriate in London. He was also serving as minister of South Place Chapel, one of England's oldest free thought organizations. According to an article from 1875, members of this urbane congregation included professors, as well as rich city families, graduates of Oxford, the president of the Royal Society of Philology, and the extreme left in politics and religion. So during Christmas time, 1875, when Twain introduced Conway to Joseph Twichell, polar opposites of the religious liberal spectrum met face to face in Hartford. On the devout Christian end, Horace Bushnell's protege, Joe Twichell. On the radical free religion end, Emerson's protege, Moncure Conway. And there between the two extremes was Mark Twain at this time, still lingering on the liberal Christian half of the spectrum, but tilting more and more toward the radical. Now, the meeting between Twichell and Conway was apparently cordial. Years later, Conway would recall in his autobiography that in no country have I met a more delightful man in conversation than Twichell, and his ministerial adventures, if printed, would add a rich volume, to the library of American humor. Twichell, however, privately noted in his journal after they met that although Conway had an acute mind, Twichell did not find Mr. Conway agreeable. He reflected that perhaps he felt this way because of his prejudice against Conway as the representative of religious doctrines which I disapprove. Now, the typically tolerant Twichell doesn't specify what these offensive doctrines were, but he most likely did not disapprove of them simply because they were radical or unorthodox. According to Charles Dudley Warner, a parishioner at Asylum Hill, Twichell was what he called a conservative progressive Christian, which meant he had a liberal and receptive mind that had resisted being swept away into any sort of unstable speculation. So while firmly grounded in his Christian faith, Twitchell's liberal and receptive mind was nonetheless open to religious views that might have unsettled some Orthodox believers. For example, while visiting Boston with Twain, they both attended what Twichell called a very interesting lecture on evolution at a place called the Radical Club, a Unitarian-led intellectual society. Upon reading excerpts from Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, printed in the Hartford Courant, which criticized the esoteric verses as what they called gropings in the dark that failed to discern any providence but destiny, Twichell excitedly wrote to Twain saying he had never read anything that uttered certain thoughts of mine so adequately. And then delivering a sermon in Cornell's Sage Chapel, Twichell welcomed the recent discovery at the time of the earliest version of the Gospel of Mark, which abruptly ends at the empty tomb and has no resurrection appearance of Jesus. Twichell especially admired how the person who discovered this ancient text had, quote, loosed himself from tradition, braved the frown of prejudice, and took his own way. Now, on these points, as well as on abolition, Twichell and Conway would have found common ground. So what was it that Twichell found so disagreeable about Conway? In all likelihood, in my opinion, it was Conway's anti-Christian views. 5 years after they met, Twichell may have had Conway in mind when he preached a sermon at Asylum Hill entitled The Offense of the Gospel. In it, he criticized religious liberals like Conway, who, while tolerant of other world religions, had become bitterly hostile to Christianity. He said that regardless of whether it is orthodoxy, heterodoxy, conservative Christianity, liberal Christianity, all are one to public scoffers who, in the name of reason, make an assault upon Christianity. For such anti-Christian critics, Twichell says, it is not that they doubt religious truth, they are down on it when expressed in Christian terms. Now, Conway was a theist of sorts when he met Twichell in 1875. Well, he said he believed, quote, that instinct constrains us to render homage to a superior principle generally understood by the notion of God. That was Conway's definition of God. But however, Twichell would still have seen him as a public scoffer who, in the name of reason, made an assault upon Christianity. For example, Conway concluded in his book entitled Christianity, published later that year in 1876, that the Unitarians of England and America have done their utmost to make Christianity consistent with truth and freedom, but they have shown that it is impossible. And even if Twichell didn't know Conway's views about Christianity, he would have been aware, in all likelihood, that Conway would be residing with the Clemens family in Hartford through much of January 1876, while he gave 3 lectures at the Hartford Unitarian Society. And one of these lectures, Science and Religion in England, may actually have intrigued the liberal and receptive Twichell. However, it's possible he disapproved of Conway's other 2 topics, Demonology or A Natural History of the Devil, which he would publish as a book in 1879. And Twain actually owned a copy of the book and thought quite highly of it. And the other lecture being Oriental Religions, Their Origins and Progress. Conway, by the way, is credited with helping to popularize Hinduism in the West during the 1870s. So in summary, the Christmas time meeting in Hartford between Joe Twichell and Moncure Conway not only reflects the extreme opposites of the liberal theological spectrum at the time, it gives us an idea of where Twain stood as well. To reiterate, still Christian in the sense of Twitchell's conservative, progressive brand of Christianity, but warming up to Conway's more radical free religion. Now, this is important, in my opinion, to know in terms of understanding Twain's treatment of religion in Huckleberry Finn. During the summer of 1876, while residing at Quarry Farm in Elmira, Twain would compose the first 400 pages of the manuscript in a burst of creative inspiration. These pages roughly encompass the first introduction of Huck in the beginning to when he and Jim just narrowly escape their raft as a riverboat destroys it. As he began to write that summer, religion was obviously on Twain's mind. Right off the bat, the manuscript's opening 3 chapters contain some of the most comically irreverent takes on the Bible and Christianity that Twain offers. Now, when the widow Douglas reads a story from the Bible to Huck about what he calls Moses and the bulrushers, he quickly loses interest when by and by she let it out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time. According to Huck, I didn't care no more about him because I don't take no stock in dead people. Later, Miss Watson tells Huck that if he would pray every day, he would get whatever he asked for. But when he tests it out for himself, Huck concludes nothing come of it. He explains, once I got a fish line, but no hooks. They weren't any good to me without hooks. I tried for the hooks 3 or 4 times, but somehow I couldn't make it work. By and by, one day I asked Miss Watson to try for me, but she said I was a fool. She never told me why, and I couldn't make it out no way. It's also in these opening chapters where Huck says that if Miss Watson is going to heaven, where all a body would have to do was go around all day long with a harp and sing forever and ever, then I couldn't see no advantage of going where she was going. So I made up my mind that I wouldn't try for it. When Miss Watson assures him that Tom Sawyer is going to the bad place, Huck says that's where he'd rather go too, because he says, I wanted him and me to be together. Now, Huck isn't entirely down on religion, however. Based on his encounters with the widow and Miss Watson, he concludes that there must be 2 providences. He says that sometimes the widow would take me one side and talk about providence in a way to make a body's mouth water. But maybe next day, Miss Watson would take hold and knock it all down again. I thought it all out and reckoned I would belong to the widow's providence if he wanted me. As you read these initial manuscript pages, Twain continues to develop a skeptical Huck who has deep doubts about the Bible and the Christian faith claims he's being taught by various people. Yet he also still yearns to belong to the widow's version of providence, which aligns with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definition of providence, in my opinion, which defines it as God's sovereign guidance and control through which he governs creation as a loving father, working all things for the good. So, which is it? Is this religious theme in Huckleberry Finn an example of Twain's growing skepticism about Christianity, indicating perhaps his movement toward Moncure Conway's end of the theological spectrum? Or does he have a more theologically positive motive, reflecting Twitchell's enlightened, conservative, progressive Christianity? Well, obviously, I say the latter is true. And I base this contention on 2 influential things that happened in early 1876, right around the time that Twain's creative energies were coalescing around his idea for the story of Huckleberry Finn. The first was Horace Bushnell's death in February, and the second involved a two-part sermon Twichell preached eulogizing his mentor, first at Asylum Hill in March, followed in April at Park Church, the progressive church Twain's in-laws co-founded in Elmira. And it's highly likely that Mark Twain heard Twichell preach these sermons at one of these locations. If he didn't, he would have been able to read them in Hartford Courant, or perhaps even borrow Twitchell's copies. Considering that Twain called Bushnell the greatest clergyman that the last century produced, he would have been keenly interested in hearing what his close friend had to say about such an important religious figure. Dubbed the Emerson of Hartford, Bushnell was as culturally influential in 19th century America as his counterpart was in Boston. The Congregationalist minister shared with Emerson an emphasis on mystical intuition and instinctive spirituality over orthodox creeds and dogmas. He also agreed with the Unitarians that the Trinity was a metaphorical representation of the Godhead, not a literal truth, that divinity was within humanity and nature, not apart from them, and that Christian character evolves from long-term nurturing relationships, not dramatic conversion experiences. Because of such unorthodox beliefs, Bushnell was officially charged with heresy and was also exonerated. However, despite his rejection of Calvinistic orthodoxy, along with his obvious sympathies with some basic tenets of Unitarianism, Bushnell refused to follow Emerson's path away from Christianity. In fact, Twichell tells the story of when certain prominent Unitarians at the time Bushnell was accused of heresy insisted that he should join them. Bushnell's icy response to them was, "I don't belong to you. I am the worst enemy you have, if only you knew it." I think it's here where we see why Joe Twichell probably found the doctrines of Emerson's spiritual son, Moncure Conway, so disagreeable. In one of his eulogy sermons, Twichell expresses a similar filial affection toward Bushnell that Conway felt toward Emerson when he says, "No human being, save my father, had ever seemed to summon me to the purpose of living a true life." Among Bushnell's traits that Twichell admires most is what he called his self-dependence. To understand what Twichell means here, recall his admiration for the man who discovered the earliest version of the Gospel of Mark, whom Twichell described as having loosed himself from tradition, braved the frown of prejudice, and took his own way. He praises Bushnell for cutting a similar path. According to Twichell, Bushnell could not borrow or use other men's views and reasons. It was his necessity to find his own, and when he found them, he had the confidence in them that comes of seeing to the bottom of the matter. Now, Twichell says that Bushnell's rejection of orthodoxy in order to find his own way resulted in a new demonstration of the reasonableness of our Christian faith that has saved multitudes of men from going over to the unevangelical ranks, who would have been forced to go if to accept certain constructions of evangelical doctrine, which some would have made the test of orthodoxy, had been their alternative. So in other words, many who would have otherwise left Christianity remained faithful thanks to Bushnell's unorthodox ministry, which Twichell praises as a sign for doubters of every degree. Bushnell's openness to confronting profound religious doubt, in fact, is a major theme of Twitchell's second sermon, eulogizing Bushnell. He reminds his listeners to what extent Bushnell was devoid of traditional faith, how far his non-believings went, how wholesale and entire his doubt once was. And yet, despite these profound doubts and non-believings, Twichell says gradually the eternal divine realities prove themselves to him till they alone seem substantial. This is why, according to Twichell, Bushnell encouraged believers to be never afraid of doubt, as well as never be in a hurry to believe, never try to conquer doubts against time. By embracing and investigating thoroughly one's doubts, he believed the divine realities will gradually prove themselves to you, so long as you pray for all the help and light you can get, and be upon your honor when you get to it to go with it where it takes you. Now, aside from Horace Bushnell, who else do we know who had deep doubts about religion? As I've already discussed, Huck is the embodiment of religious skepticism early in Twain's narrative. Huck doesn't see where ancient political stories or biblical stories about dead people hold any relevance for him. He doubts the efficacy of prayer. And if heaven exists, he would rather go to hell than to spend eternity where some of the Christians he knows say they're going. So, in other words, Huck holds the same kinds of non-believings and doubts that Joseph Twichell identifies with Horace Bushnell. Not only is Huck never afraid to doubt anything, it's basically his default point of view, he is never in a hurry to believe anything he hears about religion. But in the same way, Bushnell's doubts ultimately strengthen his faith. I believe Huck's skepticism in the Bushnellian fashion also ultimately brings him closer to experiencing the divine, albeit ironically. An early example from the book suggesting this theological connection is the similarity between Huck's and Bushnell's views towards Scripture. Twichell points out that for Bushnell, it was the soul of the Bible that lives underneath the garment of language that he craved to find, and he asked God day and night to give him a soul that could discern it. Huck is also uninterested in the dead scripture the widow reads to him. Still, he craves for what he describes as the widow's mouth-watering view of providence. And incidentally, that's pretty much at the heart of the story of Moses, learning to discern and trust providence even while wandering lost in the wilderness. It's in Twain's treatment of prayer and doubt, however, that I see a closer parallel between Huck's religious views and what Twichell preached about Bushnell. As I mentioned earlier, after Huck tests Miss Watson's claims about prayer, he concludes that they just weren't so. However, when Huck later fakes his death and runs away downriver, he has a more nuanced insight into prayer. As Huck hides on shore, he watches the riverboat search party setting loaves of bread filled with quicksilver into the water. This is a superstition that was believed to help locate drowned bodies in the river. One of the loaves floats over to where a hungry Huck is hiding, and after he takes the bread from the water and begins to eat it, he realizes, I reckon the widow or parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt, interesting word choice there, but there is something in that thing. Huck's acknowledgement here that there is something more to prayer prepares him later for when, in the midst of a serious crisis, he prays for all the light, all the help and light he can get, to borrow Bushnell's words. This is that crucial theologically complex moment in the book when Huck is faced with a terrible dilemma. Either turn in his friend Jim as a runaway slave, which he learned in Sunday school was God's will, or protect Jim and face eternal damnation in hell. And it's interesting to note here the contrast of the Boston Unitarian abolitionist Theodore Parker, who equated anyone turning in a runaway slave with Judas betraying Jesus. Just a big difference between how the abolitionists in the North were seeing it from the churches Huck was growing up in. But during his time on the river, Huck's perspective has obviously matured because the stakes are much higher now than when he flippantly chose to go to the bad place with Tom Sawyer. Under duress, Huck's social conditioning overwhelms his otherwise sound heart. Feeling low down and ornery, and believing that Providence was watching his wickedness from heaven, Huck says, "It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor for me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing, but deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. And the irony here, of course, is that Huck is right. You cannot pray a lie. And on one level, that is what he's doing here. He's praying for God's help to betray his friend Jim. On another level, however, his essential intention is still to do the right thing. There's a disconnect, however, between what he's been taught is the right thing and what he knowed deep down is right and what God knowed too. Like the widow praying earlier for the loaf of bread to find Huck, whom she falsely believes is dead, Huck is praying to God to do God's will, which he falsely believes is to turn in Jim. He's as incorrect in his presupposition as the widow was in hers. Yet, just as the widow's prayer was nonetheless answered without her full understanding, so is Huck's. Through his attempt to pray to do the right thing, God ironically can be seen as empowering him to do the actual right thing. What Twain's friends among the liberal clergy would say is to recognize Jim not as inferior and as someone's property, but as a human being and a friend. Humanizing Jim in this way is what happens to Huck after he tries to pray the lie. He says, I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we are floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. Because he can't harden his heart and turn Jim in, as Huck's churches taught him, Huck therefore believes he's going to hell. A reminiscent of Twichell quoting Bushnell's admonition to be upon your honor when a prayer is answered, to go with it wherever it takes you. Huck, in his limited and flawed understanding, bravely accepts his fate for rejecting what he falsely believes is God's will. He picks up the note betraying Jim and says, I was trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right, then I'll go to hell, and tore it up. The intention of Huck's prayer to do the right thing has been answered, albeit with typical Twainian irony. Because of his social conditioning, Huck isn't aware of his redemption and accepts instead that he's going to hell. Even so, it turns out in a roundabout way, Joe Twichell's sermons honoring Horace Bushnell seem to have contributed to saving Huck from betraying his friend the way Judas did. And we know what fate awaited Judas. Although Twain presents Huck's salvation here as steeped in irony, in this fallen world that never seems to stop falling, I think Twain still believed, nonetheless, that God's salvation, ironic or otherwise, is still better than no salvation at all. And that's all I've got to say for the presentation. So there ain't no more to talk about, and I'm rotten glad of it. But I am looking forward, I hope, to talk over what your thoughts are, and we'll be happy to take any questions or comments or whatever anybody thinks.
Yeah, so we have one question. Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. We have one question already, but to give people some time to put some questions in the Ask a Question feature down at the bottom of your screen, and here comes my cat. I want to ask you first, what got you on this topic? Was it just that one sentence that I think sticks with all of us, the "we'll all go to hell then," or what was it that got you started on this Twain and Huck Finn and Twichell religion path?
Well, it was back when I took a class. Growing up, I knew about Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and all that. You know, it's part of the lore, American lore. But it wasn't really until I took a class in Mark Twain in his times at Georgetown that really brought it down to a level where it resonated with me beyond just the sort of, oh, that's a nice story about an adventure on the river. And the one thing that really struck me when in that class, we looked at all different varieties of what was going on in Twain's era and how his books, how his writings reflected that in many ways. But the one I was drawn to the most was religion. And that was mainly because it seemed to me at that time, this was back in the 90s, a lot of the scholarship about Twain and religion really cast him as being pessimistic and even atheistic, and all of these things that his outlook on the world toward the end of his life was horrible. And when I was reading his actual writings and comparing it to what these scholars were saying, I just didn't see the connection there. I saw something. Twain was not a Pollyanna optimistic person about religion, but I found a deeper struggle. At least I sensed a deeper struggle going on in his writings that just didn't fit into this kind of negative, pessimistic worldview. And so that got me interested in researching it. And here I am now over 20 years later. And this is where that river has taken me on my adventure. But yeah, it was just pretty much a sense of, I just don't know if this is, I agree with how they're portraying Twain here. Mm-hmm. And so let me just take a dive and see what I find. And it just seemed like over the years, every avenue I pursued seemed to confirm for me that there was something deeper at work here than what, and I'm not saying, I'm so brilliant and everything compared to everybody else, but it was just another level that I thought was being overlooked by many scholars.
Yeah.
So that's what brought me to where I am.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask the two audience questions now that we have in at the moment, but if we don't get any more, and I have a couple more side questions based off what you just said, but let's get to the audience one. So the first one says, as a Unitarian, always thought we could legitimately claim Mark Twain as our own. Did he ever join a congregation or a church?
No. If the closest he came to that was renting a pew at Asylum Hill Congregational Church. He never officially joined Twichell's church. However, he was very active in it. He attended worship services regularly. And as I mentioned earlier, Steve Courtney's book on, or biography of Twichell goes into the involvement that Twain had with the church and with its activities in Hartford. And so he was very actively engaged with that. He just never officially joined. And in my opinion, I think, and this is only my opinion, I think that was probably because of this deep independent streak that he had, where I think he wrestled and found solace in religion, but he never really wanted to fully commit himself to any one thing. That's why his, as I hope I can outline in my book, how his religious path was erratic in some ways, where he was constantly going from this, that, and the other. But unifying it, in my theory, is religious liberalism, that there are many different facets of that he found himself engaged in. And I think that is what ultimately prevented him, the further along he went toward the end of his life, to not participate in any kind of organized religion. I think he was more looking for the surface. That's the surface. He was looking for something beyond that.
All right, so the questions are popping up. So we got a lot here now. Next question says, wonderful talk. I don't want to get off topic, but would you, hold on, they just moved on me. Would you be willing to comment on the mysterious stranger and Twain's place in the religious continuum? What did Joe Twichell think of the mysterious stranger?
Oh, well, that last part there, I'm not about Joe Twichell. I don't know if he knew that. If he did, if anybody knows that he did, please let me know, because that's a very important part of what I'm researching. But the mysterious stranger wasn't, well, it's a long, convoluted story, and I'll try to boil it down. It wasn't published until, or a version of it wasn't published until after Mark Twain died in 1910. It was published in 1916. However, it wasn't really the version that he intended it to be. And like I said, there's a whole story that I could get into about that, but just suffice it to say, it wasn't.
Another Trouble Begins, right?
Yes, exactly.
Talk just about
probably,
that.
Exactly. I think that would be a good, very good topic to have 45 minutes to go into. But long story short, it wasn't published. It wasn't made public. His intended version of the mysterious stranger wasn't actually made public until the 1960s with John Tuckey's research. He's the one who discovered that what was published in 1916 wasn't actually Twain's intended version. So what became of that was the publication of number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. I think that was officially published in 1980, although versions of it were available before that. And that one, that puts him, in my opinion, very much on the, that was the book that sort of, the light bulb went off for me, saying that there's a whole other level to what Twain is doing here than saying it's all hopeless, give up. It's not how in my opinion, that book ends. I find that book ending on a very positive theological point that resembles kind of something along the lines of what we think of in terms of nirvana in Hinduism and Buddhism. And rather than prior to that, the reputation has always been that it's a very negative, bleak kind of conclusion to the book. And if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about, where the narrator is left in an empty, soundless place. As I said, that would be a topic for another talk. But I see that definitely putting Twain in the religious liberal camp. And as we were saying beforehand, Twain loved cats, so I think Twain must be channeling the cat right now.
She's into this lecture tonight. Normally it's just like once and she's done, but she's into it. So
So I hope that answered the question. Like I said, I don't think Twichell knew of or read the manuscript, but maybe he did. And if he did, I'm not aware of what he thought, and I would love to find that out.
And for everybody, I put a link to, it's on the Mark Twain Project, The Mysterious Stranger. So I put a link to it in the chat if anybody's interested in reading it. I will also say that next year we have a printmakers exhibit, and at least one of the artists has taken quotes from Mysterious Stranger as their inspiration for the art. So if you're in Hartford next summer, come see it. All right. So here's a fun question. It's kind of looks like a two-parter because somebody commented on it, but it says, what do you think Twain would think of TV evangelicals? And then the comment said he has some interest in Christian Science. What were his conclusions? So those seem to be maybe two different things, but
yeah, I
together.
I think in general, my impression would be that based on how he loved to skewer the real more pompous types of preachers and those who are manipulative. And I'm not saying obviously all, these types of ministers are that way, but Twain definitely delighted in making fun of that type of minister and those who, what he called, preached from the drowsy pulpit. He definitely had very little patience for that kind of religion, and which is why throughout his life he was all the ministers that he befriended, most of them were, if not all, were all on the that liberal side of the spectrum of theology of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And so his views on Christian Science, and unfortunately that I haven't really done as much work on that, but I know that he had a lot of critical things to say about, I'm blanking on her name, Mary Eddie Baker. That was so he had critical things to say about that. I think he was always skeptical. I think that's the primary thing for me, is that Twain, there were some he respected, some theologians and ministers that he respected, some writers on religion that he respected, but deep down he was like Huck. He was never eager to believe anything that he heard or read. He wanted to experience it himself, which is why I think he was so drawn to Bushnell, whose whole approach to Christianity was, or religion itself was, to, don't just take it at face value or because someone told you that they think this is the truth because they heard it from someone who told them that it's the truth, and so on down the theological line.
So the next one, we have two similar ones, so I'll read them both. So the first one says, seems like Huck is an avatar of Clemens's relatively legalistic, simple understanding of Christian faith and life and his strong cynicism. And then another person commented, do you then see Twain using Huck as a stand-in for himself, philosophically speaking, that is?
I think so. I think in many ways he is definitely tapping Huck as a persona for himself. That's what that one quote that Steve Railton had that I showed in one of the slides was that it wasn't just that Twain had one day an idea that, it would be great to write a book from Huck's perspective. This was something that in time, gradually, before even Tom Sawyer was published, this idea of using Huck as a way to maybe tap into his early childhood memories and to voice some of his deeper feelings about things took root. And by the summer of 1876, I think it was just kind of bubbling over for him. And that's why he just cranked out those 400 pages while he was at Quarry Farm. So I do think that he was seeing Huck as a kind of reflection of himself and as a way to present some of his own views on things. And yeah, he was definitely cynical toward the more, like when he said he grew up in a Calvinistic Presbyterian church in Hannibal. And it was an experience that I think he said was like terribly boring on one end and alternately terrifying on the other, where he would just be bored out of his mind. And then late at night during a really vicious thunderstorm, believe that, he's seeing the end of the world. And so he definitely had some cynical things to say as he grew up. That's why I said, as he grew up in Hannibal, I think, and became more a young adult, I think he was moving away from that Calvinism and found it more appealing to explore these other more heterodox and liberal ways of looking at Christianity. But Twain did confess, as I alluded to, next to being a riverboat pilot, the only other strong passion or ambition he had when he was growing up was to be a preacher of the gospel. And he said to his brother Orion that the thing that prevented him from doing that was the stock and trade of religion. And to me, that's the dichotomy that I work on when I'm building my whole theory around Twain, is that there's a difference between religion and the gospel. Mm-hmm. And the gospel that Jesus preached for most of Twain's life, I think he wrote very positively about. Religion, on the other hand, he didn't think too highly of most of the time. So I hope that answers the gist of the question.
Yeah. It says, the next one says, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of these, but we'll do at least maybe one or two more. But it says, very enlightened talk. Could you expound on how Twain drifted more towards the radical end of the late 19th century religious liberalism after writing Huck Finn? What are the representative works after that?
That is also another good topic. There's the famous or infamous moment where Twichell and Twain were in Switzerland, and they were both hiking, and Twain finally just said to him that he just admitted to Twichell that he just didn't believe in his Christianity anymore. And some people, I agree with them, say that that's kind of an overstatement. Hal Bush, in his book on the spiritual crisis of Twain's time, I think rightfully points out that was too many people have made too much of that. But I do think it's an indication that Twain is moving farther and farther away from that conservative, progressive Christianity that Twichell talked about. And it's interesting that as he's doing that, and I think this is also happening in America at the same time among many intellectuals, there was a movement following Emerson toward exploring, not in a converting to Hinduism type of way, but exploring intellectually a lot of the precepts of philosophical Hinduism. And they found it much more, the esoteric teachings in the Upanishads and things like that were more satisfying and more cerebral in many ways than what they had been taught growing up. And so that to me is one of the more interesting movements that I see and that I try to detail in my book, of Twain moving in that direction. And it was interesting that in his house, I think it was I'm blanking on the year, I think it was 1883 or so, he actually met with a Hindu speaker from India who was on tour in America, and they apparently had a wonderful long talk in his home there in Hartford. And the guy's name was Pratap Mazumdar, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he was on tour promoting a book called Oriental Christ, in which he was giving his interpretation of Jesus from a Hindu perspective. So there are other examples of that, where Twain is actively exploring these differences between Christianity and Hinduism, and I think finding some appeal in some of the ways Hinduism described God and some of the other deeper things that I could go into, but I'm hesitant because I'm trying to rein myself in, because I could really start spilling over and I hope I'm answering the question, but it seems like he's moving in a direction that is where he's exploring more and more of that.
Great. All right, let's see. So it said, what is it? I see something in the comments as well about Livy's feelings about Sam religious ideas and letters of the earth, and Livy and Twichell talking to Twain about that. Do you touch on that at all?
Well, I know that obviously Livy was very concerned about some of Twain's harsher things, and it was more his daughter Clara after his death who was very hesitant to release some of these more acerbic writings, and that he had more acerbic things to say about religion too. And letters from the earth is one of them. But even in that, I make the argument that it's what Twain is, and he has some of his most vicious things to say about God and about Christianity and that type of thing. But if you read it from beginning to end, what you find is that Satan is actually, there's a difference again between Satan, who's the narrator of this book. He knows and reveres the divine one, the deity. And he makes a distinction between that and what he finds on planet Earth, the silly and crazy concoctions that human beings have come up with in their fanciful beliefs about who God is. And so if you read it, keep an eye to how Satan isn't criticizing the God he knows in the heavenly court where he's from. He's ridiculing what he finds in the religions here on earth as being crazy, and he goes into those in quite lengthy tirades sometimes. But
yeah, sounds like, I haven't read that one, to be honest, myself. So, but it kind of sounds like as you were saying before, there's a difference between religion and the gospel and that kind of there. So last question, since we're technically already over our hour time, but this one says, thank you for the talk. It seems difficult to see Huck as having put faith in the painful soul searching. He continues to believe that he is actively doing wrong right up until he finds out that Jim is actually a free man, and that never changes. We see him as doing right, but he never does. How does this fit with your sense that he is engaged in a redemptive spiritual struggle?
Well, I think it's more about Twain than about Huck. I think, like I said, this is typical Twainian irony, where Huck, maybe we project into his imagined life, maybe as he grew up, he might have, when he lit out to the territory, he came to realize, hey, you know what? I actually did the right thing. But I think in terms of what Twain's objective was, I think that is where, he finds the humor in some ways, but also making a commentary on how, I think this is a Twainian belief, how if there is a possibility for human beings to truly know God and what God wants of us, it's practically impossible just by the fact of how we're conditioned by society, by religions, like Huck was. That's Twain's goal, is trying to explore that more than, I think, trying to make a commentary on, whether Huck would have known or might possibly have grown out of that. But does that make sense? I hope.
So we have a couple more questions, and if all right with you, I'll email them to you and put them into the chat, answers into the chat later, because this is recorded. You can come rewatch it, and the chat keeps going. So thank you so much, Dwayne, for coming and giving this lecture. It was really interesting. Our audience loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate this opportunity and hope to make my way up there very
Yes.
soon.
Yes, come anytime you can. And I do want to point out to everybody that there is always a chock full of events happening at the Mark Twain House. I just put the link to our events page in the chat. A couple things to put on your radar. If you are in the Hartford area, September 18th, we're having an in-person, our second annual plant sale. So come and support the museum that way. There'll be a couple cuttings from the creeping fig that's in the conservatory for sale. So there's only two, come early. And I also mentioned that our next Trouble Begins will be with Katie Mears on October 13th at 5:30 here in the virtual space. And we'll be talking about Mark Twain and stand-up comedy. So I hope everybody joins us then. Thank you again, Dwayne,
Thank
and
you.
good night.